All right, welcome to Plan 9 Crunch. I'm Doug Gibson. We have a podcast today with Bill Kaffenberger, and he has done a lot of work in scholarship on Bela Lugosi. He has co-authored 4 books with Gary Rhodes, and those 2 of those books are Becoming Dracula, Volume 1 and Volume 2, which details the life of Bela Lugosi from literally birth, the first book through him leaving for America after the discord of World War I, and the second book takes you through Lugosi's career in America till about the Dracula. And this book is incredible because it's unearthed so much new information. And I want to talk to Bill a little bit about how they found this information. Because if you read that book, you realize they went into cities and towns of obscure newspapers, which were not digitally archived. You had to go find the originals. And of course, those had to be translated. So lots and lots of work. We'll talk about that. And Bill is also an accomplished actor. He's been in the movie Lincoln, so look for him. And maybe he'll tell you how to find him later, okay? And he's also an accomplished musician, really good. How long have you been doing musician work?
Since I was 14.
14 years old, huh?
And
Yeah,
I won't say how long since then, but many decades.
Okay. And tell us how the other 2 books that you've done with Bela are Bela Lugosi in Person, and that follows his stage career. And you've also done Bela Lugosi, well, it's not called No Traveler Returns, which is also about his work where a lot of people would think, oh, Lugosi had a tough time after making those RKO movies, because you don't see another movie for a few years. But he was actually on the road doing magic shows, doing summer stock, doing Dracula and other places. He was working his tail off. And so tell us how you met how you met Gary Rhodes to start collaborating on work with him.
Well, what I'll do is we'll start with that, and then I'll kind of give you the nutshell of up to how we actually started writing books, because the whole thing is kind of interesting to me anyway. So I've been a big Lugosi fan since I was 8 years old. I grew up in Washington, D.C. area, and they used to run the cheap horror movies on the weekend afternoon on Channel 5 WTTG there at WTTG at the time. First movie I ever saw was Scared to Death.
Wow.
And I was so fascinated with the accent and the personality, I became an instant fan. So going through the Monster Kid years, Shock Theater years and all that, and growing up and watching all his films and just having this interest, which continued on even before I started writing books. My friends and I used to have movie nights maybe twice a year as adults, and we would pick out all the Karloff Lugosi films and King Kong and different things like that, and we'd go for like a Saturday night, go from 6 to midnight just watching the old movies. Well, during this period of time, I would say probably Gary would have been about 14. It was the time when he was doing his World of Bela Lugosi journal. And I didn't know him previous to that, but I had heard about this magazine he was doing, and I offered to write some articles. So that's how we met. And so I probably had an article maybe in every other issue, something like that. And we stayed in touch over the years. We'd run into each other occasionally at monster conventions and that sort of thing. Now, fast forward to 2009. So I'm getting ready to retire from working for the Marine Corps as a civilian for 20 years. And at that time, the digitized newspapers were starting to, that whole scene was starting to grow by leaps and bounds. You started with the Google News. They had this huge collection of old newspapers. And I, just for my own entertainment, I started researching Lugosi in all these old newspapers. And of course, gradually newspapers.com and genealogy.com. And I think there was another major one. I can't remember the name. So I just started looking, anything Lugosi, I would look it up and I'd I started compiling all this information. I started realizing, man, he was really busy after Hollywood didn't want him anymore. So that's the No Traveler Returns segment. And so this goes on for a couple of years. And I was talking to Gary one day on the phone, just a random phone call. And I told him what I'd been doing. And he said, I've been doing the same thing and I'm finding all this stuff. And I said, well, what do you think? He says, well, we should figure out how we can get a magazine article out of this. And I said, yeah, it's a great idea. So he said, I'll call you back in a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks later, he calls me back and he says, we're not going to write a magazine article. And I was kind of disappointed. I said, oh, we're not? He said, no, we're writing a book. And that's what started it. So we did this intensive research at this point, primarily with, I'd say maybe 80% digitized newspapers and maybe 20% the old brick and mortar stuff, to get an idea of, really let's rebuild what his career really was from 1945 up until he left for England to do Dracula in England. And so that's how that book came about. And then we kind of worked backwards with all this information about his, not so much necessarily his stage work, but any kind of personal appearance that he did from Dracula up until the time of where we started No Traveler Returns, which would be about 1945. So we thought it would be a great idea to develop that as a book, because it's a side of the entertainment world that a lot of people don't delve into. It's like these famous people that do these personal appearances and stuff. So it was a mix of stage plays, personal appearances, and radio, that sort of thing. And then, of course, as this is happening, now all these Hungarian newspapers are getting digitized, and it wasn't widely known at the time. So we kind of got on top of it before anybody else really realized that was available. And so Gary would continue to do the brick and mortar stuff and some of the American newspapers, and I mostly was digging into the Hungarian newspapers and magazines and so forth, and going all the way back to 1901. I mean, that's how far back we were able to get.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
How did you speak any Hungarian, or did you have a helper with that?
Well, that's another interesting story.
Okay.
So we've got all this information, and we had always wanted to do something about his early years. So we decided, okay, let's take this and we'll go from birth until he signed the contract for Dracula. And we figured we got enough for one book. Well, as it turned out,
more than that.
The more we dug, and then all of a sudden we find all this new, amazing new stuff about his time in New York that nobody knew about, that he was just touring in these Hungarian plays all over the place until he phased over into American English language theater. And just all this amazing stuff, and we could not fit it into one volume. So we decided, okay, we're going to split it into two. And that's what we did. And that's how these amazing volumes resulted. And the icing on the cake, we had to go to Budapest to the National Library for a lot of theatrical stuff. One of the things, and here's where some information I can't tell you because it's going to be in the next book.
Okay, that's fine.
So I have to hold back some of this, but nobody really knew what villages and towns he was doing these theater troupes in, because he was in a mix of theater troupes that went all over southeast Hungary. And then he had a couple of times where he was in one town for good for a period of time: Temesvar, Szeged, Debrecen, and then of course Budapest. But even there he was doing summer theater, these city troops would then go out and they'd have their little circuit during the summer where they'd be doing plays. So one of the things we had to do is using the early newspapers as a starting point, we were able to figure out what towns these various troops typically traveled to. And that was the basis of working with the theater division of the Hungarian National Library to find the playbills.
Now that's great because that's the kind of stuff I want to get out of this podcast is how you did this research. It's so impressive, and because that stuff may have never been found if not for the effort to do it, right?
Now,
In these things.
it's possible that somebody would eventually have come across some of it, but this was very intense, which leads to the next story. You asked the question, well, how do we don't speak Hungarian? Well, you know, as I like to tell Gary, sometimes, there are God moments.
Hmm.
There's moments where it had to be God that opened up a door. I mean, that's how I describe it. So we were having this conversation, we could use Google Translate and kind of get a general idea of what the newspaper article or the play was or whatever, but we didn't know the exact translation of the Hungarian titles and this and that. So I was researching one day. It's like, I feel like this is going to sound strange to some people, but I feel like a lot of times God will just put in my mind, you need to get on the computer today and go look for some stuff. And
Yeah.
a lot of times this is how I find things.
I believe in those promptings. I agree with you. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
so one day I just had that feeling, today's the day I need to go look, and I'm looking, and I just happened to come across this article by a young Hungarian woman. She was a expert in Japanese art and opera,
Hmm.
and there's a big interest in that in Hungary. And so she worked for one of the museums there, and she had done this paper or this book, and it was online, and it had this photo of Lugosi with a lead role in an operetta, a photo of him and his leading lady. So I contacted her and I said, can we use this picture? And she said, well, it's fine with her, but you have to go to the people that supplied it to her. So I said, fine, and I did, and they gave us permission. And then I was talking to Gary, I'm talking to this young lady, and she has had to translate some of her articles into English. Why don't we see if she'll do the translation for us? And so we decided that we could only offer her like the equivalent of $15 an hour. That's all we could afford.
Hmm.
And so I proposed that to her, and she agreed. And so for the next year and a half, 2 years, I worked directly with this lady. I would send her the articles, and as best I could try to delineate, we don't need this, but we need this.
Hmm.
And so she would give us these really great translations, and where there was maybe some concern of what's the real English word here and there, we would kind of banter that about and come to a conclusion. But mostly, she did most of the translation just spot on. And then she actually went one or two times to the National Library on our behalf and did some research and found some interesting information, some of which is going to be in the next book. So I can't really talk about it.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'm going to buy it. I can't wait for it. I
And
go on. Go on.
and there was a time where she couldn't go, but she enlisted one of her friends. And so we
Hmm.
paid the friend to go and do this additional bit of research. They found a whole bunch of plays. We found some more cities he might have been in, and they went in and they found all these. We would have found it ourselves because it was after we had been to Budapest.
Well, I went
And
to. That's just so great. Um, I'm hoping he's been in Page, but you can't tell me right now, right? But anyway,
no, I think
I think he was there for in your book, and also Bob Kramer told me he was. I've been to Page.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think the conclusion we came to, if I'm not mistaken, I don't have the books in front of me. I've got them packed away at the moment. But it seems to me that this fellow that I was in contact with, who lived in, I'm trying to remember the name. It was the one of the first towns that Lugosi had been in, and they had done a Lugosi festival over there because it's big. I guess it's got a big fan base over there, which kind of surprised me because it's Romania now, where this guy is. And he had a photo that he said had been given to him by a friend who said the photo was taken in Pecs and that
Yeah.
he had been there, but we never found any confirming information other than that photograph. So we think he may have been there for a brief period of time with one of his early theater troupes that he was in. But that's an area that needs more research, and unfortunately there's not a lot available from that town.
Well, let me tell you, you in the book, and they're here right here if people want to see them.
Mhm.
They talk about Lugosi entered acting that was a real true profession in Hungary. He started acting. He went to Hungary. The first time he didn't make the National Theater in Budapest,
Mhm.
my understanding, but he came back and had a lot of success in Szeged, I think it's called, and also Debrecen. But he
Mhm.
acted. People will learn from your book that he acted in just about every play you can think of. All right,
Yes.
Tragedy
Yep.
of Man, The Passion, and things
Yep.
like that. And so it was. And one other thing I find interesting, maybe you can expound on this,
Mhm.
is in the acting career that in Hungary that Bela Lugosi pursued. You didn't always have stars. You may have had people who were more favorable, but you did. You could be an extra, and then you could be the star in a play. Is that correct?
Yeah. So so basically, how just kind of backpedal a little bit. So Lugosi, he left home at one point and went and lived with his sister and her husband. He was working in a mine and working as working for a locksmith and some other odd jobs like that. He wanted to be an actor. I don't know that we ever really got a clear picture of why that happened or exactly when that entered his consciousness, but it was early in his life. Uh, how it worked in Budapest, how it worked in Hungary, according to what the people at the theater division of the National Library told me, is if you wanted to be a professional actor, you had to go to auditions in Budapest. And what would happen is there were theater troupes that were authorized, there were theater troupes that were unauthorized. So it's kind of like union, non-union. It wasn't
Yeah.
quite the same, but that's the closest concept I can think of. And then, of course, there was the big cheese, Budapest, either at the National Theater or the Magyar Theater, the Hungarian Theater in English. There was also a comedy theater, and there were several other named theaters in Hungary that you might get hired to work with. Well, he was just like what, 18, 19 years old. He got somebody to get him an introduction to this audition. So he traveled to Budapest in the summer, late summer, early fall of 1901. He auditioned, didn't get anywhere, but this guy back home, back in this little southeast town, Subotica, I think
Okay.
it was. This guy hired him. So basically, from 1901 till about 1904, he was with maybe three or so different troops traveling around southeast Hungary. Then he's in Temesvar for a year, bigger parts. Then he's with the Bela troop, bigger parts, but again, they're like traveling all around the more of a larger area in Hungary. Then he goes to Debrecen for 2 years, then to Szeged, and then to the big place, Budapest. And you're exactly right. Even when he was, before he was starting to get the bigger parts, of course, he would have the smaller roles, but could be a big small role, a small role, could be a couple of lines. But then even as you get the bigger and bigger parts, and now you're getting some starring parts, but you might be in a supporting part the next night.
Yeah.
I don't know that he was ever an extra. I know there's a rumor that that might have happened, but we never found any proof of that.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, and not only supporting, lead, maybe going back and forth. Now, of course, once he got to um, Debrecen and Szeged, of course, those days were over. It was more major roles almost all the time.
Well, he was a star in Szeged, wasn't he, for a
Yes,
while? Yeah.
absolutely. And Debrecen also. And the
Mm-hmm.
thing is, it's not just the size of the part. You're doing a comedy one night. You're doing Shakespeare the
There's
next
so
night.
much diversity, isn't there?
You're doing an
Yeah.
operetta the next night. You're doing a straight drama the next night. You're doing Shakespeare the next night, and on and on and on. And plus the fact that you had to know all the lines for all whatever. If the guy had 20 plays that he did in his theater troupe,
You had to know.
maybe you're in 15 of them. You got to know all the lines. And here's
That's
the
yeah. Go on.
interesting thing that really impressed me, and it's in the book. Um, they had the prompters back then. You can picture the stage, and you know how a lot of those old stages, you see this little almost cone-like thing in the middle of the stage, but you don't see anybody because they're on the other side of it. And they would prompt the actors if they forgot their lines. Well, the thing with Lugosi, there was a review, and I think it was Szeged, where he got this review shortly after he got there for one of the plays. And one of the reviewers accused him of talking too fast
I read
in
that. I
his
remember
role.
reading that.
But there was another reviewer who understood what was going on. He said, no, Lugosi is not talking too fast. He knows his lines letter perfect. He does not need the prompter. So you're not having periods where there's silence for a minute while the guy is getting his next line.
That's fascinating. And what I like about the book is you have chapters that are just chock full of reviews and announcements and graphics, photos of their
Yeah,
different place when they're
yeah.
there. I mean, you just can sense that you get an idea that you're almost there at that time period.
Right.
I don't want to jump ahead, but I want to ask you one question when you were talking.
Mhm.
This came to me. Do you think when Lugosi moved to America, do you think it was a revelation to him to discover that that was more personality based on acting rather than a collaborative thing that they had in Hungary?
I think that once he started getting, how do I want to say it? I think once he got stuck with Dracula, shall we say,
Hmm.
I think that's, again, just my opinion. I think that is probably more when the revelation of it hit him, that it's, wow, the fact that I've played all these great roles doesn't matter in Hollywood. It's now I'm the horror man. The typecasting, and well, I mean, even look at John Wayne. Uh, John Wayne was essentially typecast as I mean, he occasionally would do other roles,
Yeah.
and he was very good in them, but he was the Western man. He was the cowboy.
Well,
And that's where he made his bread and butter.
if you look at Lugosi in the very first film he made for Browning, and it's one of the is it 29 steps I think or 17
That was
steps?
the 13th chair.
Third, it's the one where he is almost like a detective, and it's a very
Yep.
stagey movie. But
Yep.
also, I'm trying to make. I guess my point is, you see a film like The Gorilla, you see a film like Broad-Minded, you see a
Mhm.
film like what's the famous film with Greta Garbo? He made
Nanotchka.
Nanotchka. You see, don't you, that Lugosi can do just about anything if given the
Yes.
opportunity.
Yes.
Yeah.
And even if you consider, even though Invisible Ray was kind of horror science fiction, his part in that was very sympathetic. It was not at all like anything he had done
Oh yeah, I
before.
think that was a fun to have them
Yeah.
sort of switch those things.
Yeah.
Um,
International House, where he played that
oh
Russian
yeah,
colonel.
yeah, that is a great movie. I mean, isn't W.C. Fields in that movie also?
Yeah.
I think, yeah. But I love him as Pancho in Broad-Minded, even though I think Joey Brown can be a bit of a chore to get through. I love
Yeah.
how he plays a Ricky Ricardo type character.
Yeah.
20 years before Ricky Ricardo was a character.
And he was very good in that. And my favorite line in that whole movie is, he says, if you were in my country, you would be in big trouble or something like that. He said, well, what country are you from? He says, South America.
Very good. That was
He's
very
from
funny.
the whole, the whole
That's a
place
great.
is like,
It proved that Lugosi had good comic timing.
oh
Getting
yeah,
getting
yeah.
back to Budapest,
Hmm.
it seems like when he became a known person in the Budapest stage, he became more politically active, perhaps, and he was a part of what they had in that first maybe 15 years, 16 years. They
Uh-huh.
had the cafe culture,
Hmm.
where they would go to cafes and they would hold court and discuss politics and things like that.
Uh-huh.
What did you guys ever find out about that in some of your research? I'm just wondering.
Well, I don't know that we ever found out a whole lot about, other than he did hang out at the coffee houses. He even did a couple of little cabaret shows at
Did he?
places like that. Oh yeah, it's in the list. I mean, if you go back and look at the list of stage plays and other appearances in volume one, you'll
Hmm.
find several of those. After the war, he came back and he did a couple of river cruises for the
Yeah, I
wounded
remember reading that.
troops,
Yeah.
and they did like these cabaret shows on the Danube, and he appeared at hospitals, and they were like little variety shows that would put together for the guys that came back from the war wounded and so forth. But his real political activism was more in the unionizing the actors and the generally the whole theater thing. He unfortunately picked
Bela
the
Kuhn,
wrong
right?
yeah, he picked the wrong guy to align himself with, and that's kind of what got him in trouble. Which leads to another interesting story, which you'll probably remember, which his political activities are really fascinating, but this story is even more fascinating because I think it's what caused him to be under such suspicion in America, with more so with his fellow Hungarians than with the
Yeah.
general
Yeah. Tell
public.
us. I know what you're going to say. Tell us. Okay. Tell us
Yeah.
about that.
So there was this guy, uh, Bela Lugosi Buchter. This was the guy's name, Bela Lugosi dash Buchter, and he was an actor, and he was a rabid communist. He was, I would say, in those days, even though Lugosi was, dilly dallying with the Communist Party and Bela Kun and all that, in our research, I would say, and I think Gary would agree, we'd look at him more of a socialist, but more really concerned about the welfare of the people,
Hmm.
more so than the political power aspect of it.
Hmm.
Okay. But this Bela Lugosi Buchter, he was a radical communist. He was the kind of guy that Stalin would have as a right hand man. I mean, this guy was bad, and he
Hmm.
was an actor. Well, we discovered all these documents. This is one of the great things about this. All this, I discovered this in these. Um, I'm trying to think of I think it was the Budapest archives. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look, but it wasn't anything that you could find. You could see the descriptions online, but you would have to actually go to this other place
Hmm.
documents, which we did when we were in Budapest. But apparently, this Bela Lugosi Buchter, he started threatening people. He was doing all these, supposedly him and these other guys were beating some people up that they didn't like, and there was all these arrest warrants out for this guy. And the press reported this all starts coming to light after Bela left for America, but the press was reporting it as if it was him, but it wasn't him. It was this other guy. And it wasn't until I think it was either 1923 or 1924 that some journalist, some brave journalist, because they were still, Bela Kun was out, but there was the guy that came after him, who was even worse. Um, this brave journalist finally wrote this article, and we quoted from it in one of the books, that he had done the research and he laid out it was not Bela Lugosi from the National Theater. It was this other guy,
Yeah,
and he says,
that's so fascinating because we don't live in an era like we do now where that could easily happen.
"Yep,
Through
yeah,
Bela Lugosi fought in World War I. He was wounded,
Yeah.
And
Three
he was
times.
3 times, yes. And you mentioned the book. He might have even been so over war that he might have feigned insanity to try to get out finally. All right.
Well, that's what I claim. I sort of tend to think that that's what he did. But
I'm not saying he was a coward. He had done his share and
yeah,
everything, you know.
yeah. But see, what hurt him when he came to New York is these news stories were repeated in the Hungarian press in New York. These, people were reading the hometown papers, and
Mm-hmm.
this was coming across before he got here. And so when he came, and even after this stuff was disproved, Gary, I think Gary would agree with this. We're pretty convinced that there were just people that were not willing to believe that he did not have responsibility for harmful things that happened under Bela and under Horthy. But it was because of this other guy that shared part of his name.
You know,
And
it's. I don't think people fully understand how dangerous the time was then in Hungary for
yeah,
Bela's life.
oh yeah, it
I think it'd
was.
be a fascinating movie if anybody ever wanted to make it about Lugosi being involved in politics, having to flee for his life, losing his first wife, who
Hmm.
left him because of it, and then having to
Hmm.
flee to America. That's a really compelling, almost made for Hollywood tale to
Oh
some
yeah.
degree. Uh, he did a little bit of work in outside of Hungary before he left, and that was kind of thought of as a sort of enlightenment, for lack of a better term, era in film, wasn't it?
Well, it was in Germany. He was there from 1919 until sometime in 1920. We're not exactly sure when he left uh, to go to, I can't pronounce it, Trista, I guess, where the
Just
ship,
yeah,
where the ship left
yeah.
from, but kind of got the time frame down. But we don't know that he did stage. We suspect he may have, but we have no proof of that. We also think he might have done some stage work in Vienna before he went to Berlin, but have not
Hmm.
turned up anything to that effect. But he was making movies right and left when he was in Berlin. And what had laid the groundwork is the Hungarian silent films that he did, maybe about a dozen of, maybe a few more than that. They played in Germany frequently.
Hmm.
So the people in Germany knew him already. So when he went there, he was able to get a start in films right away. And most of the films he did were large supporting roles or leading roles.
Well,
He,
is there one I watched recently? It's pretty hard to understand in the truncated version, but it's called Daughter of the Night, right? Was one
yeah,
film he made
it's
there.
so the edited version of what was called in Germany "Dance on the Volcano," the
Yeah,
Tanz Vulcan.
yeah. One thing I note about Lugosi, whether it's a movie like that or whether it's a movie like Daughters Who Pay, is
Mhm.
even though he doesn't have a particularly admirable role, his screen presence just dominates.
Yep,
he, he
it
had it.
does. It does. Yeah, it's just something about it. It it was just something. Well, like when I saw Scared to Death, I didn't know the guy from Adam. First Bela Lugosi movie I ever saw, and I'm like, who is this guy, man? I got to see more of this guy's movie. I
He's
mean, instant.
commanding.
Yeah,
And,
it was something about the guy, you
and so
know.
he came to America and he had some early success because he was in the Red Poppy with Estelle Winwood. And that she apparently was a star back then, right? So that was some kind of success early.
Yeah,
Uh,
it closed. It didn't last very long. I think I want to say 11 or 14 performances, something like that. It was actually not. It was actually off Broadway.
yeah, it was
It
not
was
Broadway show.
technically not on Broadway, but at the same time this was going on, which a lot of people don't realize, he was touring all up and
That's what I
down
wanted to bring
the
up. Yeah,
East Coast with this
Arian.
Hungarian play troupe.
Yeah.
Now, in the past, now I don't know that they made a lot of money out of it, but in the past, it's always been written. I think in Lennox's book, and I think originally with Kramer's original version, although I'm sure that's been corrected for the new book. Um, it was thought that they just did a few of these plays and here and there, and that was it. But there was I would say 10 to 15 city tours of specific plays frequently
Hmm.
in two different Hungarian theater troupes that he was in New York. at least up through, I don't know, I'd have to go back and look at the list again, but it was for several years after he got there, probably at least up until 1924. And so they were doing these plays all over the place. So he was busy. Whether he was making
He was
much
a
money, I
very
don't know.
busy. He wasn't making a lot. Do you think he might have spent too much money, perhaps,
Oh,
in this
well, that
time?
was his habit. That was
Yeah,
his habit. There's no doubt
yeah.
about that. Yes.
And he was a Lothario also. Yeah.
Well,
But he was an old-fashioned. Believe me, I married a Hungarian woman,
yeah.
and I know Hungarian men. Okay, all
Mhm.
right. But he was a bit of a Lothario, I think,
He
maybe.
like he liked the ladies, but we don't dwell too much on that. I think Bob gets into that a little bit more, but we kind of just we touch on that a little bit, but we really didn't get into that
I
that
want to
bit
show
of
you.
it.
I want to show you something because I forgot the name of the company. Maybe you can just help me. There's a
Yeah.
wonderful photo in the second book where
Mhm.
he's doing an ad that's in a magazine.
Listerine.
Listerine, that's it. And then you have a photo of it, and I
Yeah.
find that fascinating because anytime I see a celebrity doing a TV ad here, I think, well, Bela Lugosi did that too.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, to give you a little hint about things to come, um, when Lugosi was in Germany, he was going to start his own company.
Wow.
So one of the things I don't think Gary would mind me giving this a little bit away, but one of the things we're going to talk about in this upcoming uh, project we're working on is Lugosi the entrepreneur. Entrepreneur. Almost said it like Archie, the entrepreneur. but but that's kind of a little hint of
That's
some of the things to
fascinating.
come.
When you say Archie, I'd say one of the Bowery Boys, Slip
Yeah,
Mahoney.
that too. Yeah. Leo Gorsi. Yeah, he
Yeah.
he was like that too. Yeah.
So, so you think there was slow, steady progress in America for his career? I mean, the finances may have gone up and down, but he was getting better known.
I do believe, taken as a whole, once he made the decision to mostly go for English language stuff, uh, I think he would probably say things are not progressing as well as I would like.
Hmm.
But if you look at the trajectory, it's definitely maybe not fast, but it's definitely up from the time he starts doing those American films. He gets in Dracula, he comes to the West Coast and he's doing the Dracula tours. He's starting to get good roles in films, especially with Fox, and then of course the 13th year with MGM. And that trajectory is up
Hmm.
to the time he gets the Dracula part. So in my estimation, uh, things were getting better for him. But as we outlined in the first book, he was always trying to get back to Broadway. He was always contacting his theatrical agent in New York. Can you send me this play? Can you talk with this guy and see, are they going to do it on Broadway? Can I get an audition for it? He was wanting to go back to New York and do Broadway until Dracula was a success. And then, of course, it flipped and he stayed out in Los Angeles after that.
There's another movie, I think. This is pre-Dracula, right? Called Such Men Are Dangerous.
Yes,
I,
excellent film.
yeah, I watched it, and Lugosi once again showed his acting vibes by playing a kindly doctor, essentially,
Yep,
right?
yep.
Yeah.
It was kind of like it was kind of like Dr. Valen and the Raven, but as if Dr. Valen was a good guy.
Good
I
point.
mean,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
I hadn't thought of that. That's a good line actually to think of that. He also in the book mentioned that I mentioned his money problems.
mhm.
He was dubbing in Hungarian films, right?
Well, we know for sure that they dubbed the last performance that Conrad Veidt had starred in,
Hmm.
and that was a big deal. And we found ads, tons of ads for that. I don't remember if we had any. I think we might have had a couple in the book, but they would run ads in the Hungarian papers, and they would have down below, like I think Victor Varconi was one of the ones that was doing some dubbing too. I may be mistaken about it. My memory's kind of, I got to go back and look in the book and see exactly what it was. But Lugosi did the main part. He dubbed Conrad Veidt's part. There are suspicions that he may have dubbed a few other things
Hmm.
for the Hungarian market, but we have not been able to find proof of that. It's
Well,
just,
that's
suspect.
yeah, that's a fascinating era because in that era, Universal was making films for other countries, but so few of those are still around. Um, I wanted to ask you, so Dracula is basically where the second book ends, essentially, right?
Yes,
Where
he
he just
signs the contract, and that's basically where we stop. Mhm.
I want to urge people to buy these books. I mean, because not just for the entertainment value, they are history. And I can't think of any genre person who wouldn't want this book, to be honest. Both books. Now I want to go to the other books called No Traveler Returns.
Uh-huh.
And if people wondering about that's actually a play he was in with Ian Keith, right? In the
Yes,
mid
and it's
40s.
that's right, and it's also on a play on Shakespeare. The land, the country from which
Mm,
no traveler returns. Which you could say that's death, or you could say it's Hollywood. He was dead in Hollywood.
mhm.
And it's in essence, other than after Stella meets Frankenstein, he never did return to Hollywood as far as, a serious career. So,
Until I read that book, I've been a Lugosi fan since I saw Son of Frankenstein when I was a kid.
uh-huh, uh-huh,
But I thought those were barren years for him. Okay,
yeah.
because I didn't see him in the IMDb right there. But you had him with his wife driving, right?
Hmm.
Literally crisscrossing the country. This man who was already over 60, right? Well into
Yep,
the
yep.
60s, going, and in the book, it seems like this may be more in the book that has Bela Lugosi in person. I'm not quite sure. I've read them both. But he would do a play, and then you have to be somewhere by the morning to get to the next play. That nomadic life is fascinating,
Well, what there wasn't a whole lot of that. I would say we picked up with No Traveler Returns from 1945. So it's
Hmm.
1945
So he
to
was more active at that
51.
time, right?
Right. So in the 40s, he did do a East Coast Dracula tour. But that was less stressful because you'd be doing a couple of days or a week, and then you'd have downtime. You get to the next town. It wasn't like literally the next morning in most cases. And then he did Arsenic and Old Lace for like what 4 or 5 months in '44. That was a little more stressful because you literally were going from one town to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next for like 4 or 5 month period. But then he'd be back. He'd be back home, making some movies or what have you. But now, what would happen after 1945? And I remember there was this letter that he wrote to I think it was Virginia Doak, who was
I've seen that letter. Yes,
one of
tell
his,
us about it.
where he says Hollywood is getting stale, so I'm having to do other things. And so, what initially happened is they would do summer stock. So in 1947, summer of 47, 48, 49, and summer of 1950, he was doing the summer stock circuit, mainly back east. Um, there was in 48, he did have a stopover in Denver to do Dracula before he headed the rest of the way. But you're right, his wife would drive. They would drive from Hollywood, generally from Hollywood to New York.
That's amazing.
Uh, and then they would go from, they'd have a week here in one town at a summer theater, a day or two off, get to the next town, a day or two off. Uh, Occasionally there would be a week gap where maybe they couldn't book anything, so they would use that for vacation time.
Hmm.
And this would carry on till late August, early September, and then they would be back to Hollywood. Or in beginning in 48, they didn't go back to Hollywood. He would then do vaudeville, uh, the vaudeville circuit in New York State,
Hmm.
Manhattan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, even Atlantic City. He was in Atlantic City one time. And this would carry them into December. And generally, then they would head back. He went back. They would go back to Hollywood it went in December 48, and he was there and did nothing until December 49 when they did the circuit again, then the vaudeville, and then they stayed in the New York area as far as we know into 1950. Then he did Dracula down in St. Petersburg, Florida. Then he picked up doing the summer circuit again with The Devil Also Dreams, which led into the Bela Lugosi's Magic and Horror show. Uh, excuse me.
It's okay.
Which went into 1951, took him up into the end of March, and then, of course, in April, they left for England to do Dracula. Now, within all of this, he is doing the occasional television show. He's doing a lot of radio. We've discovered, I will say this much as a hint, there are television shows and radio shows that will be revealed in the next project.
Cool.
So
I'm just amazed at how grueling this was for this man. It must have been absolutely grueling to his health, to doing that.
I can imagine so, but the interesting thing is, he would do things like, if there was like a boys' club that the poor kids or whatever that it was Christmas time, maybe he was doing a show somewhere, he would play Santa Claus. They would round the kids up and bring them to the theater, and he would be Santa Claus and give out the presents. He was always willing to meet fans.
Yeah, I read Arthur Lenig's book where he talks about Lugosi meeting him, actually going to his house, so I can see that personality.
Well, here, just to touch on that story, he loved his fans, and he loved finding out about other people. He didn't like talking about himself. And in No Traveler Returns, I think it's chapter 9, he meets the mayor of this small town in Ohio. And I actually interviewed the guy. The guy was like in his 90s, and I got to interview him about this. Well, just shows Bela's personality, what a kind person he was, interested in making other people feel good, finding out about them. So he and Lillian, and this is 49, so they're on the way to New York. It's 4th of July. It's hotter than the dickens. Lillian and Bela Jr. go into the cafe to get some food, and they had parked the car in this little Ohio town, and he's just leaning up against the car, and he sees these two kids playing in the yard, so he starts tossing the ball with these two young kids. And the mayor, Bob Edgington, he must have been maybe 24 or 26 at the time, and he was the mayor of the town. And he's sitting up on the porch. He says, "It's awful hot. Wouldn't you want to come up and sit on the porch?" And so Lugosi, he gives the ball back. It was Bob's son and daughter that he was playing with. And so he's walking up the sidewalk, and Bob shouts out to him, "Are you who I think you are? I am he." Says, "I am he." So he gets up and Bob is relating all this to me, and Bob had a tear in his eye the whole time he's telling me about this, which after all this time, he's a 92-year-old man that is still impressed by how nice this Hollywood star was to him. Just a little no-town mayor in the middle of nowhere. So Bela spent like 45 minutes just talking with Bob. "I don't want to talk about myself. Tell me about your town." So, and Bob was saying he treated me like a friend, like I was a long-lost friend. And, this just shows you the kind of guy he was.
That kind of stuff is wonderful to hear about him, because it's so easy not to do that, if you're a person. But talking about how he was able to endure this, I don't know if you've read Frank and Andy Dix's book on the Dracula tour.
Oh yeah, I've got a copy.
Yeah, I've got a copy too. I have both actually, first and second volume. But they're not two books. One was added. But that schedule, if you were in the music halls, you were playing all night essentially.
Yep.
Yep. It's just, how much money was he making during that time period, do you think?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about some of it. I don't know about the spook shows, and I don't know really about the vaudeville. I can surmise about the vaudeville. I know that at one time he was doing this Telltale Heart tour out in the Midwest in the middle of winter, and just it was an awful situation, I'm sure. He quit that because he could get I don't know, I think it was something like 1,500 a week doing vaudeville back east. So
That's a
he
lot of
went
money
back and
back then.
started doing, yeah. So I would say for his vaudeville stuff, he was probably getting 1,500 to 2,000 a week. I'm guessing. Um, for the summer theater, it was minimum 750 a week, and if you put that into today's money, that was it doesn't sound like much, but it was a lot back then.
Oh, I know. I go to inflation calculator to find these things. I'm
Yeah.
amazed.
Yeah, so he was doing okay when he was working, but the problem was when the summer's over and the vaudeville's over, and you got to go back to California, or you you miss your son for another year,
Yeah,
and
that's hard.
you
Yeah,
stay in New York
it'd be hard.
because that's where the work was for him then. Was on the East Coast.
Wow.
But he did all right when he was working, but the problem was when he wasn't working, and that was a real issue.
Hmm. I wanted to ask you. Let's see what time it is we have here. Okay, we've been
I got
talking.
as much I got as much time as you want until I can go for another half hour if you need to. So
There are some questions I have about Lugosi. Um, well, first I want to ask about a guy many people think is a scoundrel, and so far I think he is. On YouTube, there's Lugosi doing well, it's one of the Edgar Allan Poe stories on
yeah,
YouTube.
that's the Telltale
The
Heart.
Telltale Heart.
That's the same
Yeah,
thing he did on that
and
tour.
the guy's name Bob Marlowe, or what's his name?
Don
Don
Marlowe.
Marlowe. Was Don
Let me
Marlowe a villain, or is he somebody who tried to help Lugosi?
well, I'm not gonna speak for Gary on this one. I think Gary would agree with me, but I'm gonna give you this. This is the Bill Kaffenberger view because Gary may have other thoughts on this. I don't think so, but um, so Don Marlowe claimed to have been in our gang, was not.
No, he wasn't.
He used that as a promotional tool. He was a small time comedian. Uh, I have found I've found advertisements in my research where you could see where he was doing little vaudeville shows and dinner theater and stuff like that. He was an agent for a time in Hollywood. He did have some of the older stars
Patsy Kelly, I saw an ad
yeah,
of his once.
yes, yeah, that was one of his. So my view is I think it's almost like the Ed Wood Lugosi relationship
Hmm.
where he was helping him, but he was also using him.
Hmm.
So it was kind of a little of both. And I know that there came a point. I mean, he's the one that arranges Telltale Heart tour where they would go in and they would do they would show a Lugosi film, and then Lugosi would come on stage and do the recitation of Telltale Heart. But it was all these little small towns out in the Midwest in like November and December.
Yeah,
I mean,
cold.
it's like, and I think that's why Lugosi skip the rest of the tour because man, I'm going back east where it's at least halfway warm and I can make more money. But there came a point. I think he really did try to get things going for Lugosi, but I think there was also some self-interest involved, and there came a point where we never found out why, but Lugosi at one point, and I think it was around 1948. I think that was the end of the relationship.
Hmm.
I think Lugosi probably kind of woke up to, this guy's really not doing me a whole lot of good. It's fascinating. A lot of these letters we didn't get published, but this is another God moment story. So I got to tell you this one because it's how we found out a lot of information for that
Sure.
for that about the summer theater and all. Um, Gary, we were talking on the phone. He says, Bill, why don't you try your luck at the New York Public Library? I can't get anything out of them anymore. And I told Gary, well, Gary, I'm going to pray about it, and then I'm going to call up there. I'm going to tell them what we need. Um, and we had found out the names of his theater agents
Mhm.
in New York, and that their papers were at the New York Public Library. So I just said, well, today I'm going to call. I called up, and I guy answered the phone, and I said who I was and what I was doing and what I was looking for. He said, I can help you with that. And he goes, he said, tell me, all the folders and this and that you're looking for, and we'll go and I'll send you an email and you can call me back when I've found them. Well, a couple days later, maybe a week later, get the email from the guy, call him up. He found all these personal letters between Bela and the theatrical agents,
Wow.
back
I've
and
read
forth. They
those are
talk between Don Marlowe and Lugosi, and Don Marlowe and the theatrical agents, and it's spanning from like 47 through probably 51, and then this fascinating letter in 54 where they tried to get Bela to do Dracula in Bermuda, and he couldn't do it. It was just too far to go, too little money. But in these letters, so this guy read me every one. He said, I'll go through and read them, and you tell me which ones you want, and we'll copy them and send them to you, which is what they did. And I'm talking about files this thick of
That's
stuff.
incredible. I remember reading a letter, maybe in one of your books, where he's telling a female agent of his that he may have to go move on because she's not getting him work or something. I remember
Yeah,
reading.
that was one of them.
Yeah.
But the fascinating thing was these letters from Don Marlowe to Lugosi's theatrical agent in 48. Marlowe was almost putting Lugosi down the list and trying to get this guy to take some of his other actors.
Wow.
And I have a feeling that probably is what ended the relationship. I mean, it was very obvious what he was doing,
Yeah.
and it's like, I don't think, I'm not sure we may have printed one or two of those letters. I don't recall exactly which ones, but that kind of was, you could tell that things were going sour. And so again, he helped him, but he used him, kind of like, Ed Wood, same
I
idea.
I that interests me because Ed Wood, Frank Delestrito just published letters that Ed Wood wrote at the time he was in Lugosi was in the Silver Slipper, okay?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And a lot of what you're talking about, Marlowe, sounds like a lot of the kind of stuff Ed Wood was writing, almost giving him, just giving him. They're in. I think they're in the back of Bob Blackburn's new book on Kathy Wood, if you're ever interested. Okay, but it just seems like when you telling me that Don Marlowe wrote those kind of letters, I just recently read letters like that Ed Wood wrote to Lugosi.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think a lot of the similarity too is, like, to be honest, and again, I'm not speaking ill of the dead, but just based on research and what we've seen, Don Marlowe and Ed Wood a lot of times weren't real familiar with the truth. So you can't always take what they said or what they wrote as factual. A lot of it was, but a lot of it was not.
I've heard that he claimed to have the lost Frankenstein footage in the
Don
70s.
Morrow, he did
Yeah,
he did not.
yeah,
No, he had ads trying to sell it, and people would try to go see it, and it was always an excuse.
yeah. That's interesting.
Always an excuse.
Well, I just think Lugosi struck me in the 30s as a man who would sit by the telephone and wait for people to call him. Okay, but it seems like 10 years later he was maybe more astute in trying to get the right kind of agents and everything. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, I think to a certain extent, again, this is my opinion. I think Gary would agree with this assessment. I think he probably left too much to his agents and not enough of pushing himself, because they didn't do that in Hungary. That wasn't the way you did it.
Yeah.
Now, he did have an agent in Hungary, which we found out. We didn't find out much about this guy, but there's one advertisement in the book where it actually says the name of Lugosi's agent when he was in Budapest. But I think after that fallow period when he couldn't get work, which was partly his own fault, in the sense that he did not push himself with his agents and with other people like he probably should have. And I think after that period, he was much more astute about, getting involved and trying to get himself more work. If a lot of these letters that we found from the New York Public Library, the ones that he wrote, you can see where he's, yeah, I want to do this, but maybe it would be better if I did this. Can you talk to this guy and see about, this town? And so, there was a lot, he had a lot more involvement trying to keep his career going. Of course, as for the Hollywood part, it was probably too late, but it kept him alive and busy in those, last years.
It's fascinating. I was telling you, it would be interesting to see like a Netflix miniseries of Lugosi trying to make a living in the late 40s, or a movie along the lines of Stan and Ollie of Lugosi's last Dracula tour. But those are just wishful thinking. You don't know if they're ever going to do that or not.
Well, we would always say they ought to make a movie out of our books.
That would be great, wouldn't it? Yeah.
That's what we always say.
Hey, so I wanted to talk a little bit more and tell people that you are an accomplished musician. In fact, just say Bill Kaffenberger and Alexa, you get a nice listen, all right, for a while.
Yeah, and if people are interested, they can go to www.billkaffenberger.com. That's my homepage. All my most recent music, the links to all of it are right there. And through those links, you can then find the rest of my musical catalog. And there's also a tab on my homepage where you can see about some of my film work as well. And also I'm on IMDb as William Kaffenberger.
Well, that's the second thing I want to talk about. By the way, we'll put a link to billkaffenberg.com on the YouTube video podcast.
Yeah, just spell it right. It's Kaffenberger, Bill, www.billkaffenberger.com, not Kaffenberg, Kaffenberger.
Yeah,
a lot of people get that
Kaffenberger. I remember that.
Yeah.
But you've been in a lot of films that people probably have seen you and don't realize it. Lincoln is one I think I said earlier.
Right.
You're also in House of Cards. And tell us, look, a lot of us think, what's it like to be an actor? Okay. And just tell us how you got into it and what the routine is.
Well, okay. Well, I will say up front that most of my work has been, I've had, I don't know, 5, maybe 7 or 8 speaking roles. And then most of what I do is what you would call featured background, where it's a larger background role, but you're with the main actor. You may not necessarily be have any lines, but you're visible. You're not on the back 40 and gee, was that really you, Bill? That kind of thing. So how I got into it, when I was in high school, me and, we had this little comedy group called the Nobodies in Particular, me and 4 other guys. And we were kind of like the Marx Brothers of our high school. And so we would do all the class plays. And myself and 2 of my friends from that group went to Virginia Commonwealth University to college to study theater and drama. Me and my one friend, I changed majors because it was just too hard. My other friend dropped out totally. And then my third friend, Richard Rivera, you can look him up on IMDb. He is a working actor today. But I gave it up. And I went and got normal jobs and continued my music through my whole life. But basically left acting behind. Well, I had this friend, Jim Howard, rest his soul. He passed away a year ago. He was one of our comedy group. He hit his midlife crisis at 40. And he was saying, I wished I had gone into acting. I don't know why. And his wife said, well, get an agent and go into acting. So he lived in the Washington, D.C. area. So he did. And he started getting these small parts, non-union at first. And then eventually he got a speaking role in I think it was a show, the precursor to Law and Order. It was the show from which that show was born. And he joined the Screen Actors Guild. Well, we were going to a concert down in Richmond, Virginia one afternoon, and he says to me, well, they've got this open casting call for this new TV series called Commander-in-Chief with Gina Davis. And this was back in 2005. And he said, can we go to that first? And I said, of course, it's no problem. So we went and we're in line and he filled out his paperwork and gave the gal his photos and we're getting ready to leave. And she says, well, where's yours? And she looked at me and said, where's yours? I said, oh, no, 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 no. Fill it out. When you go home, take some selfies and email them to me on Monday. Okay.
That's amazing.
I had no intention, no intention, And so I did, and I ended up getting a small non-speaking role in the first episode of Commander in Chief with Gina Davis. And then my daughter, and that was it for a couple of years, but then my daughter decides that she wants to go to the first, was the first graduating class of the cinema department at Virginia Commonwealth University. And they started doing they all had to do their little movies.
Mm-hmm.
So I started getting these little small non-speaking roles in their movies. And then she knew somebody who got me a role in this Hallmark, I think it was a Hallmark thing called A Christmas Kiss.
I saw that on your IMDb page.
Okay. So I was a party goer and a theater goer in that. And so I'm saying, hey, this is pretty cool. You get fed and, you show up, you sit around and you get a little room to yourself where you can, talk with the other actors and whatever. And I'm thinking this is pretty cool. So I got an agent, the local guy there in Richmond, and he advised me of this part. This was around, I want to say 2010, 2011, somewhere in there, 2010. Williamsburg in Richmond, in Williamsburg, Virginia, the Williamsburg, the park, the national park or whatever it is, mm-hmm. they do these films for distribution to schools. And they're like these historical films that are 1 hour long. It's like a made for TV movie. And they were having auditions for their version of the War of 1812. And they wanted me to come and audition for the Henry Clay's opponent. I didn't have a name. I was just the
Henry Clay's opponent.
Yeah, but it was a speaking role. I had I had 3 big scenes, so it was a big deal.
That's
so
cool.
I went and auditioned for it. I didn't know what I was doing. I sat with my daughter. My daughter came over and I said, direct me, because I don't know what I'm doing. I know nothing about this, And so she helped me out with that. And I went down and I auditioned. And so, I had the lines memorized. I mean, they allowed you to have the script, but I had the lines memorized. And so I did the scene. And then the director says, Bill, let's do that again. And can you do it this way? And he gave me some parameters. And of course, I'm like, sure. And so he says, take your time. And I thought about it for a couple seconds. And then, so I did what I thought he wanted. And he said, thank you. And then he said, can you stick around and read some of the other parts for some of the other people that are auditioning? And of course, this was all good. But I didn't know it was good at the time, And so I did. I stuck around for another hour or two. And then 2 weeks later, I got notified I got the part. And what the director later told me is one of the reasons was because when he gave me a different direction, I was able to do it. And so that was my first speaking role. And then how I got in Lincoln is really interesting because that was filmed in 2011. So I started doing these little small things around Richmond. And then I don't know, it was 2010. It was my daughter's final year at VCU. And of course, they got all the scoop. A lot of people don't realize a lot of films and television shows are made in the Washington, D.C., Maryland corridor. Mm-hmm. So I got to be in things like House of Cards, that Veep was filming there for a couple of years. Homeland filmed their 7th season there, a whole bunch of others. And so she said, Dad, grow your hair and your beard. And I said, why? She said, I can't tell you, just do it. And so I said, okay. So,
well, that's great.
So that's how I got in Lincoln. I went to an open call And then I was actually asked to do a reading for a speaking role. I went up to Charlottesville to the agency that was running it, and I didn't get the part. But then they had a invite only auditions for people that had applied for a speaking role and didn't get one because they wanted to put them in the movie.
Uh-huh.
So they had them meet with the extras casting director, and I'll never forget the day I went in and I talked to this guy. We didn't even talk about the movie. He says, "Well, what do you do?" "I write books about Bela Lugosi. I do this," because we were starting to write the books at that time.
Mhm.
And I'm a musician and this and that. And he looks at his assistant and said, "Mr. Kaffenberger's got a real nice beard, doesn't he?" And,
Good
and,
advice from your
and
daughter.
right. But that was it. And he said, "We'll be in touch." And I thought to myself, I'm thinking, yeah, sure, right. But it was fun. So I figured that was the end of that. He called me personally on the following Monday. He said, "We need 4 people to do a makeup test, and we'll pay you for a full day. Uh, Willing to come down to they had rented this warehouse outside of Richmond and turned it into a movie studio for the scenes that had to be done on sets." And I said, "Sure." And then a couple of weeks went by. I didn't hear anything else. And it's fascinating because nobody ever called me and said, "We have booked you for the film. Are you still available?" Never happened. And so, my daughter got hired in the art department.
Mhm.
She's working the art department for like the whole 9 months they were in town filming and pre-production and post-production. And um, so I would call her regularly and say, "Have you heard anything?" And she's, "No, I don't know. I haven't heard anything. I haven't seen anything." And then one day, this was the funny thing. She's walking down the hall, and what they would do, because I ended up visiting her at the office one day, and what they would do is all the people that have been hired, they would put their picture up in costume, and next to them the real person. Now they didn't do that for the background people, but they did have all their pictures up in costume. So my daughter's walking down the hall one day and she sees my picture hanging on the wall with all these other, and I know nothing. Nobody's talked to me, nobody's called me. And I forget the guy's name, but the extras casting director, his first name was Billy. I forget his last name. He's walking down the hall coming towards my daughter, and my daughter, they had met before, in the office there. And so she says, "Well, I see my dad's picture up there." "Oh yeah, he's gonna be a Republican congressman. Tell him we'll be calling him soon."
That's just the way things happen sometimes. I mean, they
That's
already had you picked a long time ago. They just hadn't bothered to call you yet, right?
No, nobody said anything. But the second fascinating story, and I hope it doesn't bore people, but I think it's fascinating.
Sure.
And then I got one more after that. I'll tell you real quick. So they the guy finally called me and he
Mhm.
says, we're having a special rehearsal on Saturday to set the lighting and set things up and everything, because we were filming at the Virginia House of Representatives, was being used as the Congress. So she said, "We're picking a certain number of people of the Democrats and the Republicans. We're not going to rehearse you at the same time. We're keeping you separate. You're going to be separate. You have your own green room the whole time. You're not going to be seeing each other except on the set," because they wanted that conflict. They wanted to create it. And in fact, the Congress scenes, they filmed them consecutively. That
Did
was
they?
like 2.5 weeks. It was like being there for 2.5 weeks. I mean, that's literally how they did it. So I get there and they say, "Okay, Mr. Kaffenberger, they put me on the second row." So I knew right away I was going to be visible. People would know it was me. It wasn't going to be like, "Was that really you?" I mean, it was right there in front of the speaker's podium, one
Mhm.
row back. And they had names of the star players. They had their names on little stickies on different places. And so I'm just sitting there, waiting for them to do whatever. And there was this guy. His first name is, I think his first name was Andy. I could be wrong about that, but he was an assistant director, and he always works with Spielberg. He's one of Spielberg's right hand men for a long time. So he's And I do a very lousy Australian accent, but he's walking around looking at all the stickers. He says, "Hey, why have they got Tommy Lee Jones at this seat?" And he picks the sticky up. He walks around, slaps it down on the desk next to me.
That was fortunate.
And I'm thinking, this is going to work out really nice. so,
These are
so
interesting things because people don't know about this life.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and so the filming starts, we're in there. Tommy Lee Jones was a pussycat. He was the nicest, just absolutely nice to us. Treated us like we were on his level as actors.
That's nice of
It's
him.
just a really, really nice guy. And so, we filmed all these scenes, and you really had to put a lot into it because he wanted us to be those congressmen.
Hmm.
So they were really, they had the fake smoke going through and the fake cigars and cigarettes and all papers crumbled on the desk. Just that you would have thought you were in 1865 or 64, whatever it was. And so they wanted the realism. That's why they kept us separate, and that's why they filmed it in sequence, because they wanted us to come in each day like we're back in there debating this very important amendment. And it got to the point that we all had that feeling. And it came to the final day where they were doing the actual vote, and they had done a piece of that, but they wanted to have more votes. They needed like some more scenes of people voting, so they kind of came back and did that extra on the last day. And so we're in there sitting around, waiting for things to happen. And this gal comes around, and we see her going over on the Democrat side, talking to 4 or 5 people. We didn't know what was going on. She wasn't talking to everybody. And then she came over to our side, and it was 4 or 5 of us. And she said, "Okay, your name, and you have a number. If you're an actor, whether you're the number one guy or the number 1,000 guy, that you have a letter, an alphabetical letter, and you have a number, and that's your number for the film. That's how they identify you. That's how they keep your costume straight. That slapped onto your costume, and all of that." So she got my name and my number and a couple of other people that were over in that area. We didn't know what was going on. I had no idea. So we had broke for lunch, and lunch, by the way, is at 2 o'clock. So anyway, it's really, I guess you could really say lunch is really dinner. Breakfast is lunch, lunch is dinner, whatever, some of the time. So we came back, and what it was is they were giving us all lines. They were going to let us all be the people that were going to vote. So I actually got bumped to a speaking role, which made me eligible for the Screen Actors Guild. And Spielberg himself ran the camera and directed us
No
on
kidding. That must have been a
all of
thrilling
those votes.
experience to have Steven
All
Spielberg.
that was, and he got to me, and it's just, again, I hope this doesn't bore people, but I just find it fascinating. I mean, I'm at the point where I don't know, and my acting was in high school. I'm
Mhm.
still learning. I've learned a lot up to that point, but I'm still learning the business at this point. And so, I was to say yay. The speaker says, whatever my name, Representative John A. Cason of Iowa, and I'm supposed to say yay. And so I just kind of leaned forward and at my desk, and I said yay, and he said, "Okay, let's do it again." And yay, and he said, "Okay, we ran out of film. We're gonna do it one more time." And he says they had to change the film. And so he said to me, "The next time we come back for the third time, I want you to lean back in your desk, lean back in your chair, look into the camera." They don't normally want you looking right into the camera, but I was to look right in like I'm looking at the Speaker of the House, and I'm to say my yay. And so I had about 3 or 4 minutes to think about, how am I going to make this memorable? Because there's no guarantee that they're going to use any of this,
Mhm.
because a lot of the guys didn't end up getting in the film. So they had certain people that were radical Republicans, like the Tommy Lee Jones character.
Mhm.
And And as a background player, they generally want you to at least get in your mind some kind of character that you are, even if you don't have a line. They want you to have some kind of motivation for what you're doing, especially in that type of a film. So I had decided days prior, I'm going to be a guy that I'm a Republican. Maybe I'm not really that much in favor of this amendment, but over the course, hearing the speeches, I've now been radicalized to where I am going to vote for this thing. I'm now in agreement with Tommy Lee Jones. So that's what I had been thinking about. So I said to myself, I am going to make the most arrogant, you stinking Democrats, we've got you now, yay vote that I can possibly put in my voice without overdoing it. That was what I was thinking. And again, I didn't know what I was doing, but that was in my mind. So he comes back and said, okay, let's action. And I did. I leaned back. I said it like I wanted to say it, and he moved on. And
Well,
later,
it's interesting being directed by Steven Spielberg. That's for
yeah,
sure.
yeah. And I'll tell you, as long as you're okay to keep going for another minute or two, two more things about that were fascinating. And again, it has to do perceptions of the business.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking, gee, I had such a thin resume at that point, made out a few things. I wonder why they picked me to have the vote, to say the line. You bumped me like that. And I was talking to my daughter about it, and there's this dead silence on the other end. And then after about 20 seconds, she said, Dad, you got bumped because you're my dad. He said,
Yeah,
because they.
well, you had that. Yeah, well, it really wasn't nepotism.
Well, and that happened. So that was my first experience of experiencing nepotism in the
Hey,
entertainment.
you had a veteran of the industry helping you, your own
Yeah,
daughter, right?
right. So in the fall, she had moved out to LA,
Mm-hmm.
and her first job was working for Spielberg's company because they remembered her from Lincoln, and so they hired her for some part-time work, and they got a special invite out there as crew members that had been on the film to go to a premiere. So she and a friend of hers went to the premiere, and so she called and I says, do you want to know if you made the film or not? At first, I didn't want to say, yeah, tell me. She said, well, you didn't get in as many scenes as I thought you would, but you were in a lot of scenes. And I said, your line stayed in and you got a full screen close up.
Boy, I can't wait to watch the movie tomorrow. I got to see it again. I want to see it.
And it's only a couple of seconds, but my gosh.
You told me that Tommy Lee Jones, a guy with white hair, and you is the key to find it, right?
Yeah. And when I say the yay, it's like literally. I got to go to a premiere a couple months later in Richmond with my daughter's ex-boyfriend at the time, and he was working crew on that. And when I saw that close up, I couldn't believe that was me. I said, I can't believe they kept that in. And what's funny is my daughter's friend, I asked her, well, what was her reaction to my how I did it? She said, they turned to me and said, boy, he was being arrogant when he did that, wasn't he? So what I did worked.
Yeah, you had the right instinct, maybe. It's interesting because I think a lot of people would like to try to do that, but they have no idea how to get into it. Okay, and I interviewed a guy named Ron Ford several months ago who's done a lot of acting too. He's a genre guy, and it's just very interesting. I think not only for me to listen to it, but also for other people to find out what it's like, because all we see is the movie. We don't see all the stuff that goes. Well, we do have to probably end right now, but I wanted to thank you so much for giving us so much insight into Bela Lugosi, and you and Gary doing those books. We're looking forward to the next one. Maybe when the next one comes out, we can do another thing this time on Plan 9 Crunch again. And talk about it.
Would be nice if we could do it both together with you. Would be fun if that's
we
possible.
can do two people. We do that a lot of times. And
that would be great.
I appreciate you for doing this. It's really good because we try to give people, as much about the genre they can get, and talking to people like you who've done the research, I'm envious of that. I hope to try to do some of
Oh,
that research too.
it was fun. And let me just say one thing about this upcoming project. I really can't say more about it than we project late this year.
Late this year.
And
Okay.
that's the projection. Gary, you can punch me if I wasn't supposed to say anything at all, but I really didn't say that much. It's just like we have something we're working on. I think people will be delighted with it, and hopefully this sometime late this year. And
Okay.
that's really
I'll
all I
say
can say.
that's fantastic. I'll say what I say. This is Plan 9 Crunch. Plan 9 Crunch at YouTube. Plan 9 Crunch at TikTok. I don't know much about TikTok, but I've done some TikTok stuff. And Plan 9 Crunch podcast and blog you can like at Facebook. And we have over 1,000 reviews, including of some of your books, at plan9crunch.com, which is just a strict blog. Anyways, thanks, Bill. And that's a wrap. Thank you, Bill. This is really great.